I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to Slee Rickets. Thank you all for listening, and thank you especially to those of you who have recommended the show to somebody that you think might like it. I'm grateful for that, and it really is how new people hear about the show. So you have my gratitude. This week, I am speaking with David Kern. He owns, along with his wife, he owns and operates the bookstore Goldberry Books in Concord, North Carolina. He is the author / editor of 30 Poems to Memorize Before It's Too Late. I was about to say Before You Die, which would be probably a slightly different collection. Though that's what I, anytime somebody says before it's too late, I always read that as meaning before you die. I don't know if that's what's intended. Or if I'll say sometimes I'll say like, I hope we meet again before too long. And what I always assume that implies before one of us dies, before death, this with too long or too late, right? Anyway, that may not be what David intended with his little anthology, but he is also the host of like 3 or 4 podcasts. Well, one is forthcoming, a kids podcast, but the other 3 are all quite successful, including the wildly popular Daily Poem and Close Reads. He is a really, really well-read, really thoughtful, intelligent guy. And that's why I was especially curious when I learned that he has this pet theory or a pet. He loved this movie Wild Mountain Thyme that came out in 2020. That was universally panned. Like everybody hated this movie. Critics hated it. Audiences hated it. The Irish hated it. The Irish Americans hated it. Everybody hated this movie. But David loved it, and he didn't just love it on a personal level. He has a defense for it. He really thinks it's actually a genuinely good movie. So I was really curious about this, especially when I learned that it was written and directed by John Patrick Shanley. I knew him from when I was a kid. I knew his work from when I was a kid, and he wrote this play Outside Mullingar that Wild Mountain Thyme is based on. So I read the play, I watched the movie, I talked with David. I still pretty strongly disagree with him. I think the movie is quite bad, but it was a really enjoyable, really entertaining conversation. And he makes a strong case. He makes a pretty fucking strong case. He also indulges me in talking a little bit of poetry shop. He also, and he helps me figure out a problem I've had when it comes to religious poetry. I think he actually has a pretty smart read on all of that. But I enjoyed this conversation. I hope you will enjoy it too. I'll have links to all of his stuff, or at least some of his stuff on the show notes. Probably can't fit it all in the show notes. Let's get to that conversation right now. This is David Kern.
I love this weird movie, and most people do not. So
yeah. Well, and I love John Patrick Shanley, and the play is really strange and sad and wonderful in a way that, like, I have a kind of a working theory maybe of the play versus the movie. So I'm just curious though, because this was so Outside Mullingar is a John Patrick Shanley play. It premiered on Broadway in 2014. He's probably best known as the author of Moonstruck and Doubt, though he's also written some wonderful short plays. Yeah, and it was a success on Broadway, not a huge success, but it did well. And then it was adapted into a movie in 2020, written and directed by Shanley, and starring Jamie Dornan, Emily Blunt, Christopher Walken, and then I don't know how to say the Irish name. Dirbla Malloy is the Irish actor. Yeah. She's the only cast member from the original. The movie was a big flop. I mean, in terms of like the critical response to it, in terms of the box office, it's like a 25% on Rotten Tomatoes. The Irish Times said the accents are the only thing that aren't terrible in this woeful mixploitation flick. I mean, there's like you look up reviews of it,
and then you have other people who like hate the accents.
Right. Oh no. I mean, like that was when the trailer first came out. apparently all over Ireland, people just dunked on how bad the accents were. And there's like, Christopher Walken's accent is not great, I would say. But I thought, to my idiot Yank mind, it didn't particularly bother me.
Which was Shanley's whole thing.
Yeah. So before we dig into what there is to criticize about the movie, I just want to hear because lots of people hated it. You really loved it. I want to hear like your take on this movie for people, because my guess is most people listening have not seen it.
Yeah, I mean, if you're listening to this podcast and you haven't seen the movie, there's probably going to come a point when you're going to need to go watch it because the ending. I mean, I don't know if you can talk about this movie without.
Oh, I think we have to spoil it. Yeah,
yeah,
I
we'll have to spoil it at some point. Yeah. I won't spoil it yet, though.
Sure.
So one of the things I love about this movie is I'm sorry, I should say that the movie's title was Wild Mountain Time, whereas so there's a new title for the movie. So go ahead. Right. Also, Shanley did Joe versus the Volcano, which
is that's right. Yeah.
Which people, kind of got it's kind of got a cult following now. My friend Josh Gibbs, who also really likes this, loves Joe versus the Volcano. It's like one of his favorite movies. So he's a big John Patrick Shanley guy. But I love the weirdness of this movie, that how it keeps you on your toes, how you kind of don't really know what it is that you're watching through most of it. And then when you get to the end, you're less sure of what you just saw.
Right.
And so it's very rewatchable. Like, I think a lot of people don't go back to rewatch it because they think it's so weird and bizarre and they get turned off from it. But I love the rewatchability of it. I've watched it four times maybe since it came out.
That is, I'm impressed.
Well, and partly because I show people it because it's kind of one of those that kind of want to see what people's response is going to be. And I've got a couple friends. We'll get together and watch movies on Sunday nights periodically, and it came up there. I showed my wife it recently. She liked it too, although she didn't. I don't think
didn't love it.
Didn't love it quite as much as I did. Okay. I think that the rewatchability is great. Like if you see, it's a very well put together. It's a very well structured film. So when you're going back and watching at the beginning and you know what the ending is, he's laying all these hints out.
That's true.
There's so many visual things that he's like cluing you into it. Yeah. I also think that frankly, it's like a pleasant movie to watch, even if you think it's kind of silly. It's beautiful. The cinematography is beautiful. The Wild Mountain Time song is a beautiful song. Yeah. As an American who is not trying to like I'm not worried about how people feel about the Irish accents.
Right. Yeah.
I'm the kind of person that Shanley was making the movie for. He told Jamie Dornan, the irony is Jamie Dornan's from Belfast.
Right. He's Irish.
And he's Irish.
Yeah.
And he talks about how if they were doing actual accents that the people who live in the place where the film takes place you'd have to have subtitles on the screen. Right. It's like Welsh or Old English or, reading like a different language.
Emily Blunt's accent, I think the observation the Irish critic made was that it's sort of like a universal Irish accent. It like blends elements it's very pleasant and recognizable to an American ear. And Shanley is Irish American. He's not.
Right. That's the whole purpose. He said, I want this to be for my people who came from Ireland or are interested in Ireland, but they can't understand what people from that part of Ireland actually sound like. Shanley's the kind of guy who he kind of doesn't care.
That's certainly true.
He's not real.
He does whatever he wants.
He's not trying to make a realistic film here. He just doesn't even go for that.
So there's so many paths to follow because I am curious about I definitely understand not wanting to get bogged down in verisimilitude because that can be really tiresome. Mm-hmm. And there's certainly there was a stretch when I feel like I was like being asked by my wife to watch a bunch of movies that just felt like misery porn. Like we were just watching like really gritty representations of like actual shitty small existences. And I thought like, well, that's, I believe that, but like, what am I, so this is, this is certainly like, I think people have made like Lucky Charms jokes and like, it's a very magical, it's like magical, St. Patrick's Day Irishness. So I believe that was deliberate. So why? Like, why that choice? Like, why not make a movie about Irish Americans in New York, say, like a Alice McDermott story?
I guess we have to ask. I don't know. I don't want to put words in Shanley's mouth as far as that goes.
Yeah,
but I think
his intention I'm less interested in than like what is that? What is the effect or what's the you know?
Yeah, I don't know. I think this is. I think we don't as what century are we in now? 21st century Americans.
Yeah.
I don't think that we're great at folktales and fairy tales, like just in terms of internalizing them, feeling like they're right. We want to watch. We're okay with it for kids' movies, sort of, but even there, they like are encroached upon by like the things we care about now, and we want to watch the movies we care about are like movies about gangsters and people who crawl into horses to survive winter, and and even our romances tend to have like it has to be like hard sci-fi or have some kind of like Groundhog Day effect going on for us to like accept the world. But here we have like all these allusions to mythology and to folklore and to fairy tales. And I think that we don't really speak that language. And so a lot of that kind of, and I don't mean this as a criticism, it's just, it kind of flies, it just kind of goes over our heads. Sure. And so the whole world begins to feel like it's a little bit haphazard. So when you watch a movie like this, and there's the stuff about the crows, and there's the stuff about the bees and the birds and the time, the Wild Mountain Thyme, not T-I-M-E, T-H-Y-M-E. There's all these allusions to things that are like really rich parts of Celtic and Irish folklore. And I think when you put all those pieces together, you begin to have a puzzle that actually looks like something. But when it feels haphazard, it doesn't make sense. And so it makes for kind of an unusual watch where then you're kind of just like, well, Emily Blunt sings that song pretty well.
Yeah. If that was her real voice, she sang quite well. I thought it was good. I mean, it
Mary Poppins, doesn't she?
Right. No, that makes sense. Yeah, no, I mean, it is there's so much prettiness in the movie. I mean, just the lushness of the grass and the hills in this movie, you feel like is like a major part of what, of the story. And partly just because I read the play before I saw the movie.
And I have not read the play.
Right. So I'll say like what's striking is that the play starred, it's a romance basically. It's these two once young people, now kind of middle-aged people growing up on farms next to each other, and Rosemary and Anthony, and it's sort of clear that they were meant to be paired up and somehow never have been. And there's this, she's sort of pining for him, and he maybe is pining for her, but also has this other problem that he doesn't want to talk about. And in the play,
I like how you put that.
Well, right. I mean, it's just, we'll get to it. We'll get to that because that's a big one. Yeah, it's a big part of it. But in the play, Anthony is played by Brian F. O'Byrne, who's a terrific character actor. Mm-hmm. And Rosemary is played by Deborah Messing, who's probably best known from Will and Grace. And apparently was, her performance was celebrated. She apparently did very well. She is a beautiful woman. She's also like 15 years older than Emily Blunt. And Brian F. O'Byrne is a wonderful actor. He's not a Calvin Klein underwear model as Jamie Dornan. Like he looks like a character actor. Jamie Dornan literally is an underwear model. And he's probably best known from being the male lead in the 50 Shades of Grey. So
although now he might be in an Oscar, Belfast.
Belfast, that's
Oscar
right.
For Best Picture this year. And true. Ironically, I like that you're bringing this up because a lot of people are complaining, so to speak, about how that movie is about like nobody's parents are actually as sexy as Jamie Dornan and his wife in that movie. Like nobody's parents actually look that good. So right. Yeah, I mean it's true here too. Emily Blunt and Jamie Dornan are pretty beautiful people.
And particularly because he's meant to be he is a sort of a little bit of a fumbler, and he's kind of in the play. Both in the play and the movie. He's kind of made fun of for not being enough of a man. Though the logic behind that always seems kind of squirrely, and it doesn't see. I'll say it's not typecasting. It's right. Sort of, it feels like they grub him up and they put him in some ugly clothes. Boy, he still sparkles. Like it is a little. In that way, I guess it is. It's sort of, it all feels a little bit fabulous, a little bit magical. Though John Hamm is a he gets a little less true to life as the story goes on. He becomes a little more of a fairy tale character, but he at least kind of comes in as like a rich New York asshole, and there's a little, I feel like there's a little like acid flavor that cuts through some of the fairy tale sweetness of the movie.
Yeah, and I don't know. I mean, when I talk about fairy tales, I don't necessarily even mean that fairy tales a lot of times they weren't necessarily always.
No, fairy tales are brutal. I mean, yeah, I've read the Grimm fairy tales. I've talked about this actually on the podcast before with my daughter, and like there's some really brutal stuff in there, even more brutal than the blood, guts, and weird sexual suggestion is the bleakness and the arbitrariness of so much of the like they very much take place in a universe ruled by chance in many cases.
Well, and I think that this movie is taking place in the shadow of those kinds of stories. And so for the characters, the idea of being cursed is this really key idea. Like he thinks he's cursed. His dad thinks he's cursed because of his mother's side, right? And so they're sort of like inner turmoil, the problems that they're having with their own like psyche and figuring out who they are, that seems to be informed by this idea that, I'm cursed. And so then you have these images of like the crows, and they're talking about who's going to shoot the crows. And like crows are this really intense image in like Celtic mythology. Crows were sacred. You had like the war goddess came as a crow. So you have all these like images hovering, and of course crows literally hovering over these characters. And I think that bleakness is like informing the worldview that these people now farm in, if that makes sense.
Oh, totally. And so Rosemary's father, Chris Muldoon, is famous for shooting at the, he's tears holes in the sky, shoots at the sky. And there is, I think there is certainly a sense that he's sort of furious at heaven, and at, whether these are old gods or new gods or whatever. And in the play, I don't think this is in the movie at all, but in the play, there's a pretty, I mean, it's both in Shanley fashion. It's like both wrenching and very funny. There's the story about how he had a son that was named after him, Chris Muldoon, who was born with a terrible birth defect and died soon after. And it was after that he started shooting at the crows. So there is very much a sense that he's sort of shaking his hand at the gods. And I mean, and there's like, it is a little bit lighter in the movie than in the play, but there's like a fair amount of talk of depression and suicide, and they feel very isolated out on these farms, and there's not, I mean, there is again, it's more explicit in the play. There's a lot of talk of like wasted years and like, he was part of everything. Now that part's where, like the fog wiped from the glass, and what am I given that? A tiny thing, certainly. There's a lot of reflection on how puny and insignificant they are. And so it feels a little bit like there are moments in it that are very cartoonish. And then there's a really dark set of concerns. I mean, that's something Shanley does in other work, and I often love it that he's able to give his characters often have an ingenuousness that feels like just a hair away from being corny, but it allows him to take them to certain places that might be hard to get to otherwise. I wasn't ever sure in the movie if he got that tone under control. To me, it felt like my instinct is always like a writer should not direct his own work in almost all cases. And so I kind of wished he had someone else to play tug of war with.
Yeah, he could have had Kenneth Branagh direct this, and then he could have directed Kenneth Branagh to Goodbye Belfast for Kenneth.
Right, they could have traded off. Just because I think a little bit of that, somebody to say no to you is maybe a good thing in something like this.
Where do you find those? Where do you find that lacking? Like in terms of not being able to really settle on that tone?
Oh, I mean, I thought, and again, so there's, again, it's partly unfair because I am coming from the play. Like one big difference between the play and the movie is that there's no scenery in the play. You hear about the farms, but everything is sort of on a dark stage. There's a line when she says, "Do you not love the farm?" And he says, "I hate it for a prison." And what came to mind, because it is truly like the most beautiful emerald landscape you've ever seen in your life. And I was reminded of Mel Gibson and his Hamlet, lolling on a hillside, looking out at these sort of beautiful rolling hills and saying, "Denmark is a prison." I think like, if like the bleakness that the characters voiced felt a little harder to place in the world that we were seeing. I thought there was a lot of explanation of, I mean, part of it maybe is like in a movie, you want to give a little sense of, you don't want to be cramped in a kitchen the whole time, but there were lots of, the whole opening was a kind of an introduction of all the backstory, but the backstory comes out pretty well. I think like even the American cousin, who was the John Hamm part, he's really sort of an offstage threat in the play, but his real significance is the choices that Tony and Anthony make with regard to him. They're not really his choice. So I felt like he was opening things up in order to make it big and cinematic, but it felt like he let some of the steam out of the pressure cooker of the play that way.
So it didn't hold the tension.
I think there were also just like odd little moments. There was a lot of like slapstick with Jamie Dornan, which felt like they were just trying really hard to make him be laughable when he just looks like an underwear model falling out of a boat.
Yeah, I was going to where he's fishing and
like in a way that feels like it's not even. It doesn't even feel like that credible that he's trying. Like really good slapstick. Your heart goes out to the guy where you understand what he's trying to do, and then he fucks up and he falls on his face and it's funny. With him, it just felt like he was doing goofy shit, and I thought, well. Then there was that weird moment. I don't know if you caught it early on where they say, I think they even flash back to it. They refer to John Kelly, the grandfather, and they say, well, you're as crazy as John Kelly. He thought he was a fish. And they whip out a photo. So tell us about the photo.
I don't know if I remember the exact photo. I was just going to mention the fish thing because I think that's what they're trying to harken back to with the boat stuff. He falls into the water.
Right. Yeah.
I don't know if I remember that. What's exactly
the photo? They whip out a photo, and it's a sepia tone photo of Jamie Dornan in weird makeup doing a big goofy grin.
It
just feels like, oh no. Yeah. Like they say, like just tell us he looked like John Kelly. Don't show, So again, it felt like there are these moments that felt like they were campy or sort of deliberately goofy, but then
do you think they're just trying to appeal to, the romantic comedy audience with that stuff?
I think maybe. I mean, it did feel like, because my suspicion is that a lot of what there is to love, because I know you're not alone, you're not the only person who loves this movie, but my suspicion is that a lot of what there is to love in the movie is sort of what's there in the play. And then to my mind, there's a lot of kind of added on decorative elements that feel not, like I would say you get the scene where Emily Blunt sings Wild Mountain Thyme in the bar, and that's quite a beautiful scene. And you even have a little moment at the end where they're singing together and you see sort of all of the living and the dead and all of their family, all of the people in their lives are sort of in the audience in the pub. And it's it's like a moment of magical realism that feels credible and feels like it's connected to everything that has happened in the movie so far. But most of the big, like the whole trip to New York and the John Hamm stuff and the Rolls Royce, like a lot of that stuff felt like it was.
That's not in the play.
Hitting. No, none of that's in the play. A lot of that felt like it was hitting romantic comedy beats that I thought like, well, don't just like go ahead and make the even weirder movie that's just like that you could make and just forget all this other stuff.
I wondered if there was like studio notes.
Oh, I'm sure there were. I mean, there had to be, right? Because he had all these like movie stars,
Can we talk about the ending though? Because
please. Like, why don't you? Okay. Yeah, you give an account of it because it is. I have very mixed feelings, but it's fascinating. It's a very interesting ending.
So throughout the movie, Jamie Dornan's character, Anthony, has had this problem that he doesn't want to talk about to anybody. And he tells Rosemary, Emily Blunt's character, that at one point he did tell a young woman that he liked, and she fled.
Yeah.
So the movie is telling us, that he has this dark secret that he doesn't want to talk about. And she is trying to get him to pay attention to her. And he, for various reasons, but predominantly because of this secret, sort of doesn't allow himself to fall in love with her. He doesn't allow himself to have genuine affection for her or make a connection or anything. And then at the end of the movie, one thing leads to another, and they have a conversation, and she finally convinces him, tell me what this thing is. And he says,
I believe I am a honeybee.
I am a honeybee. Yeah.
Yeah. And that seems to be pretty straightforwardly what he means. Like,
Yeah.
I believe I'm a honeybee. Yeah, sorry, go
right.
ahead.
And then she says, well, everybody thinks there's something.
Yeah, everybody thinks there's something they're not, which I thought was
right.
quite nice. Yeah.
And then he says, no, I really do. And she's like, well, I think I'm a swan. He says, no, you don't. So
you don't
I'm
literally
curious,
think you're a swan. Yeah.
Do you think, do you take that at face value? Do you think that he literally thinks that? Do you think that he has some kind of mental health issue? Like, a lot of people are reading this in a lot of different ways. And I think how you read that line within the context of what they're trying to do is going to determine a lot about how you feel about this movie when you rewatch it, for example.
Right. So, and you're right that throughout the movie there are seated in these. There's like a scene where the dad's watching bees, being smoked out of the hive, and she's a smoker, and she finally quits smoking for him, and so there are like a number of these little.
Early on, as a child, he's sniffing flowers,
right. And then Fiona laughs at him because he's got pollen on his nose.
Yep.
Yeah. So no, they do build up to it, and he even he uses language about he's going to fly out in the fields. He says he feels like he's flying. Yeah, I mean, that to me is classic John Patrick Shanley. Like, that's like the first encounter I had with him was this weird little semi-magical realist series of plays called Welcome to the Moon. And it's like a play about a guy who falls in love with a mermaid. So like that kind of scene, I almost don't care if it's meant to be. I mean, to my mind, like I had a mentor when I was a kid who used to say that the difference between a symbol and a metaphor is that a metaphor is both the literal and the figurative. With this, like, and I think like that's sort of how I take it. I'm not all that concerned about like, oh, what does this saying about mental illness? I think I do take it at face value, and then I also take it as having metaphorical weight. And he says, because he also says that he thinks she says, "Am I a bee?" He says, "No, you're a flower." So there is. I mean, there's something really childlike and touching in this moment about it. I do think that some of the incredibly strange and genuine wonder of that moment is a little bit undercut again by like the sexiness of the movie stars and the gorgeousness of the movie and like these like goofy slapsticks that's where I feel like the honeybee stuff, I didn't object to that. I just sort of wish he had committed more to making that movie.
Yeah. No, I see that. For me, in a way, Jamie Dornan being as beautiful as he is kind of like makes it funnier because, someone like him would normally have this like degree of confidence about them. Right. And he has this, I don't know. I think for me that works, but I do see what you're saying about the tone. Like it could have even gone weirder. Do you, I really think this is one of those movies you have to watch on its own terms.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
You can't, I think a lot of people, reading, I went back and reread some of the reviews and capsules and stuff. Yeah. And people are just like, it just makes me think people don't know how to read.
No, well, that's certainly true. People definitely don't know how to read. And I think that
they're trying to make it something that it's not.
Right. Well, no, I think like people definitely came to it deciding that it was going to be one thing or another. I think my objection to it is mostly that I wanted it to read itself on its own terms a little more than it maybe it did. It felt like it was
like define its own terms more clearly, maybe.
Well, yeah, and just go ahead and be its own weird movie. It did. Like there's and one of the things that the Irish Times review made fun of was that they're constantly referring to the fact that they're Irish, and even like the first line of the movie is "Welcome to Ireland." And I think like it's totally fine to make a movie that's effectively for like Irish Americans or for like Americans kind of imagining a version of Ireland. But it did feel like shticky in ways that I didn't like. But like part of what my experience with his stage writing is that it's like walking a razor's edge, because if you wink at what you're saying even a little bit, it totally fails. The only way to do it is like commit fully to these sometimes like insane lines, and then they can be really, really powerful. But it just felt like there was in a way, like it's the problem that you get sometimes when you have the wrong director, directing a movie and where he's sort of trying to force it to be a different thing. In this case, I don't know what kind of compromises he was making, but it felt I felt like it was a movie that sort of believed it was something other than the movie that it was, in a way. Like it was sort of like all the characters in the play, in the story.
I've been thinking a lot about the idea of like this being like a folktale.
Okay, yeah.
And one of the things that's common in folktales, as like, I don't know that folktale writers would say that this was the goal, but that's common in folktales is that they're like meant to be like a unifying tale or a unifying like idea or story or something for a community. It gets passed on, right?
Yeah.
Like often in oral tradition, and sometimes they're cautionary tales, sometimes they're not, but in some way they're like a story that is meant to kind of define who you are. Yeah. And I think that in a way Shanley was trying as an Irish American to make a folk tale for Irish Americans, not so much for the Irishman who lives in this county and could understand what they're saying.
Oh, right. Yeah, no, it's not for them. Yeah.
But I think that he's trying to, like, he is calling upon or sort of, using, I don't know whatever phrase you want to use, all of these allusions to that folklore and that mythology that was from the homeland, and then he's putting it together. I think for me, that's why the sort of degree to which it's calling upon its Irishness works, because he's speaking to a particular audience. So that doesn't bother me. The logic of that doesn't bother me. I agree that it's a little bit like, I don't know if you said kitschy or what.
Sticky.
A little bit sticky, a little like, I mean, in a way, a little like cute or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
I agree with that. But I think that, I think that's what he's doing. And so I kind of am just like, this is what you're doing. It has its moments when it works. It has its moments when it doesn't work. But I can see what you're going for. And I accept that. And the parts that I don't like, I can sort of set aside because I like the rest of it. Right. But I don't know if I can understand if that's not what everybody wants to do,
Yeah. I think if this movie had been a more earnest version of itself, or a more earnest version of like an adaptation of the play. Again, the play feels like it would be really powerful to watch on stage. It doesn't feel like it needs to be adapted into a movie. I wouldn't think, I mean, somebody gave them the opportunity to do it, and I guess it's hard to make movies, and so if you have the opportunity, you do it, but it just felt like, oh no, don't adapt this one. I do imagine that it probably would have been disliked for different reasons had it been, I think it probably would not have been a hit either way. I'm a little bit curious because there's some sort of like philosophical or theological suggestions in the movie that my guess is that if there had been a little bit less "Kiss Me, I'm Irish" to it, then there's I could imagine contemporary critics fussing at the movie for some what might be seen as like traditional a traditional vision of romance. In some ways it's a very old-fashioned romance.
I saw one review that said, I wish I could point to it. I don't remember who it was. I just happened across it, and it said something like, this is a movie that pretends to be a feminist movie, but in reality it's the opposite. And so this reviewer hated it for that. And I was like, I'm trying to figure out where they got the idea that it's trying to be a feminist movie.
I don't think it's trying to be a feminist movie. I just think it's trying to tell a story. I mean, and that's the thing. It's not, neither is it an anti-feminist movie. It's telling that part of the movie, and that scene, which is in the play, it's the very last scene in the whole thing. But the scene where he goes into her kitchen with her, that to me was the strongest part of the movie. And it also felt like the moment where the two of them really fell together, like their chemistry lit up in that scene. It felt like in a way, like it felt like the movie had warmed up enough. And I thought like that scene was terrific. It's terrific in the play. It's terrific in the movie. And it's also a very kind of old-fashioned romantic scene. I mean, it is, I'll say, like, it's one of the...
It's like a Neil Simon.
Right. Well, it is, scene. But it's also a little bit, it's got a bigger heart than some Neil Simon plays do. And
that's true.
Even like the sort of the weird little moment where she's trying to suss out whether he's gay or not, or what his story is, where she's like asking, do you think of what I wear when I wear less? I mean, there's like, it's such a, it's such a decorous, fully clothed suggestion of sex. And yet it's so electric. I mean, it's really it's a wonderful scene. And the two of them together feel very much like they could be in a romance from 70 years ago.
And one thing that's great about this, I think, is that it's like it's condensed into a room, or maybe two rooms, I guess. So it has that element of being on the stage, right?
Right. Yeah.
So like I think what worked on the stage is now being translated to this one room.
Yeah.
And even the way the camera works, like the way they're crossing back and forth, there'll be times when they'll be having a conversation and like they'll pass across each other.
Yeah.
And it's clear that they're not like, she is trying to create tension to figure out what is really going on with him. And he's like turning around and rejecting her and going in the other room and trying to be busy. And she's just constantly moving towards him and he's moving away. And then in the end, they move towards each other when he's finally, and when they do finally move together, he is finally able to say what his issue is.
Right.
And then it's in her court.
Yeah.
And then the irony is, well, I don't know if this is irony, but the interesting thing is they then leave the room.
Right.
And then she has to decide that while they're leaving in the car.
Yeah.
She has to decide how she's going to respond to his coming to her finally.
Which I thought that, they do have a weird moment where she drives away. She's driving him, theoretically she's driving him to the airport to pick up John Hamm, who's coming to Ireland to propose to her. She drives her truck into a tree, seemingly like on purpose and kind of for no reason. I did feel like that was a place where I was, had they not animated the John Hamm character so much, had they not made that so much a living, breathing part of the movie, then you could do what you do in the play, which is like, well, that'll get resolved later. Like, we don't need to worry about him because this is the story in this.
Yeah, and when you cast it with Don Draper in it, you got to
you got to go back, and then he meets a nice lady on the plane anyway. So that's good
for him. Well, can I ask you a question about you're mentioning like the sort of ideas and theological or otherwise that are kind of threaded throughout the movie? Was there a particular something that you were thinking of?
Well, so there's
besides fate
early on. Yeah, there's fate early on. What I was going to say was just that like in a play versus in a movie, physicality is really, really charged. Like having somebody on stage touching each other, or like a kiss, or even like someone in underwear is like really, really powerful on stage. Whereas in a movie, like you have like 50 naked people chopping people's heads off and you don't blink. That was a scene where I thought like you got a real sense of the power of a little bit of physical movement and a little bit of touch. It was really, really wonderful.
You put them in like that bottle.
Yeah, where she just reaches across his hand and it just, you feel like the hair stand up on the back of your neck. So no, that's a wonderful scene. So early on, and this, I don't remember in the play, there's a scene where the little boy, Anthony, sees a star low on the horizon out the window and he seems to be praying and he says, "Why did you make me as I am?" Mm-hmm. And then later, in basically the father's death scene, he sees the same star, and there's lines that are in the play that he says to Rosemary. It's a little more offhand in the play about we're on the land, or the animals are over the land and we're over the animals, and something is over us, something tends to us the way we tend to the land, and then she has a line in that last scene, I think, about, it may not be explicitly God, but it does seem to be like there's a sense of providence. And I wondered about that in the movie because in the play, there's a lot of, and then there also is like the Chris Muldoon shooting at the sky, though he didn't lose a child. So it's a little more mysterious. Like he seems to be shooting at the sky only because of this weird little turf disagreement. In the play, there's a lot more. There's some of that is in there, but also in there is a lot of despair, a lot of a sense that like nothing is looking over us.
Yeah.
There's our lives are essentially meaningless except for maybe a little bit of joy we find between each other. And I was left feeling like they were sort of interesting possibilities raised, and then I didn't quite know what to make of them, particularly in the tension between the two. Like it seemed like a strange turn. Again, it was like an existentialist could have directed the play, and then like almost not necessarily a Christian, but like somebody with a much more hopeful vision of the universe seemed to make the movie.
Have you seen Doubt or read the play?
It's wonderful.
Because do you find that when you read his, I'm trying to remember when that came out, I'm looking it up, but do you remember do you feel like when you read his work that he is is attempting to answer the questions that you're seeing there?
No, I don't think he is, and that's part of what I found really really effective about Doubt is that there's not a it doesn't at all answer the question of whether I mean there's a lot of things that there's a lot of doubt in the play in the movie, but you are left with the sense that the questions are not going to be answered for you. And I didn't, it's not that I wanted them to be answered in the movie. It's just that there seemed to be an articulation of, or an expectation of providence or of a kind of a godlike presence that didn't, maybe it's just because I read the play and there's so much despair and bleakness there. And there's such a sense that the problems they face and the loneliness they deal with. And she talks about suicide and depression in the movie, but it's much more tossed off. That all felt like it was connected to this sense of being abandoned by the universe. And so then seeing all of this invocation of providence in the movie, it then made me wonder, like, well, so what does that have, like, does that say anything about their despair or their loneliness or it just felt like a strange,
why is she talking about it?
Right. Why is this why bring it up in the movie and then why, like juxtapose it with a lot of the same problems that in the play were juxtaposed with a mostly much bleaker outlook.
Yeah.
And the answer might partly be the same reason that there's some romantic comedy goofiness.
Yeah.
It's like,
so
pessimistic movies do not do well.
Well, do you think that any of this could have to do with like some of the imagery of like it talks about her as a swan and Swan Lake is a big part of the movie.
Yeah. Though they make much more of it in the movie, and they even take her. She goes to see the ballet in New York, but also in the play there's also a sense that it is a slightly sad coping mechanism.
It is this very lonely, cursed figure, right? Like, but then when you get to the bee, like the bee and the flower is this very communal.
They're united.
There's the pollination, which again, this movie like references sex in all these like very indirect ways, like a lot, especially in the end, in ways that are very like, unusual.
But I mean that I thought that's all lovely. I mean that's all. Yeah, I thought that was quite nice.
But that seems to like that image like of their communion, of their relationship, like that's more romantic than most romantic comedies are going to give you.
Oh, sure. No, I mean, again, like I have no objection to that. I think it feels less desperately needed here, I think.
Like, it's just earned less.
Yeah. It's a lovely, strange thing. And I do wonder a little bit about this question of like having a metaphorical sense of like, oh, I'm like a swan versus I literally believe I'm a bee. That I wondered if there is something interesting there about questions of like belief or because she even says like, I go to church, but I wouldn't go if you didn't go. I only go to see you there. I found, I'm always interested in like belief and like half belief and, so I mean, that stuff, I that's the movie I wanted, right? That's the stuff I wanted this to deal with more. There is a question I had for you that it's a little bit less played up in the movie, but the story of the father and the mother is actually a much weirder story than it seems to be at first. So the Christopher Walken, Jamie Dornan's dad, old grouchy Irish guy, Tony, he sold off just the right of way, just this little stretch of land between his farm and the road. He sold it off some decades ago, 20, 30 years ago, to his neighbor for £200 because he needed money. We're told that he was in a bad way. He needed money.
Yeah.
So it's been a sort of a minor but notable inconvenience for decades for them, and he wants to get it back. He talks about his son with total scorn. I mean, he's really pretty awful to his son, and he's awful also in the beloved mother, his beloved wife who's dead. He refers to his son as belonging to her side. He's a Kelly. You're all Kelly. You're not a Riley.
You're all crazy.
You don't come from me. I don't see a straight path from me to you. You're not mine. You're a Kelly. You're more like her father than you're like me. Your eyes aren't right. Your face isn't right. in the play, there's even a moment later on where Rosemary really presses him on this point and says, like, what do you do? Why are you threatening not to leave your farm to your son? Because he says, like, I don't want to leave the farm to Anthony. I'll leave him the money, but I want to sell it to my nephew, who is a Riley and who wants it. And then I'll just give the money to Anthony. He can go do something else. There's a pretty strong suggestion in the play that Anthony is not Tony's son. That because he even says when Rosemary says, like, what is the deal? Why are you not going to leave the farm to him? He says, there are things I have sworn to see. I've sworn to my wife that I would never say. I swore on a Bible I would never tell you, and I'm not going to tell anyone, and I won't tell anyone.
It's like straight out of As I Lay Dying.
Right. He goes to his grave with this secret, and he I mean, it seems the only obvious answer to the question of what the secret be in the play appears to be that this was not, that she had a son by someone else. And he even says that, like, while later on there's this really strange and moving story he tells. He says when Anthony was a kid and his sisters were kids, he didn't love their mother, that he didn't really love her until well into their marriage. And he sort of married her for convenience. He married her because he was lonely, and they kind of got by, and she sang in the kitchen. She was lovely, but he never really cared for her. He never really gave her what she needed. And then he was struck by this feeling, this something in the field, and he falls in love with her, and he sells the plot of land, not because he needs the money to keep the farm going, but because he wants to buy her a proper gold wedding ring. He'd given her a brass ring. And so he sells the patch of land to give her a proper ring. And he says they lived out the rest of their days in bliss. That it's such a strange revelation. I mean, it's moving and it's sort of wrenching. And it rings weirdly true. But then it also makes me think about the song Wild Mountain Thyme, which, like, is a love song. But the end of the song is, if my true love will not come, then I'll surely find another to pull Wild Mountain Thyme. Like, so it does. And you hear that line in the movie. And so I kept thinking, like, well, why is he suggesting all this without then doing anything with it? Or, like, in the movie, he backs off of it a little bit. It doesn't seem quite as, it's not quite as sharp-toothed as a suggestion, but it just made me think, like, well, why is it there? What?
Yeah. This is a movie about being lonely.
Yeah.
So much of it is about being lonely. And I think the work itself, the life that they're living, comes with loneliness, even when ostensibly you're with somebody. And I think that's one of the reasons why, like, I talked about that scene where in the house where, like, they block it such that they're moving to each other and away from each other a lot. Yeah, the blocking in that scene was and I think that this is one of those stories in a lot of ways that's about people moving towards and away from each other. So Mullingar the play takes place in Killican, and I think it's a similar, they make reference to a similar sounding town in the movie, but so Killican is a town outside Mullingar. Mullingar is a town the size of the small town I live in, which we don't even bother to say Barbaro. We just say, like, oh, next to Chapel Hill, like left of Chapel Hill. So outside Mullingar is like, if your biggest landmark were the small town, it's like 20,000 people. So that, and the kind of the ugliness of the name, really does give a sense of being out in the sticks, out in the middle of nowhere, out where nobody particularly cares that you're there. Nobody's especially interested in this little corner of the world. And I think that, along with, like, stripping the play of all of the beautiful scenery of the movie and spending much of it, like, in a kitchen or, like, smoking outside by a barn, it feels, again, like, with older, less attractive actors, it feels much more like there's a real need for both. Like, they talk about escape and a lot. They talk about, whether they use, like, one of them uses sports to escape, or one of them looks at travel stuff or reads magazines, or one of them even talks about, like, using technology just to, like, soothe himself, because it's a way not to think about his thoughts. They talk about that a lot in the play, and you see the need for it. You see the need for some kind of diversion or distraction or some kind of something, including her metaphorical sense of herself as something more than just a farm girl, and his maybe not metaphorical sense of himself as something other than a farm boy. All of that feels like a lot more
urgent. Whereas, yeah, I mean, I think the title in a way, like the title change suits the change in tone from the plate of the movie. So again, like I don't think Outside Mullingar is gonna sell a lot of movie tickets. I mean, I don't know if Wild Night in Time did either.
I don't think so.
The comparison that came to mind was the I can't remember the guy's name. He was the showrunner of House of Cards, but his break was a play called Farragut North, which is the street in DC where all the consultants are. And,
oh yeah,
and he that play was adapted into a movie that they called The Ides of March, which had nothing to do with the movie, but they needed a snappier title for the movie, so they Farragut North I felt like was sort of
the one with Ryan Gosling?
Ryan Gosling and George Clooney.
Oh, Beau Willimon.
Beau Willimon, that's right, and a great Philip Seymour Hoffman, who was also in Doubt. Who's
that's interesting.
I wanted somebody with that physical presence in this movie. Like I wanted somebody with that sort of growling, palpable misery and depth of feeling that he had. Do
you think that Jamie Dornan just didn't do a good job, or that he just wouldn't have been capable of doing the job that you're looking for, just given how handsome he is?
I think probably both. I think he's not a great actor. I think Emily Blunt's a wonderful actress and did very well in this. I thought she played, but that role is also a little bit of she's referred to as a beauty, and she is a little bit of a slightly, wild and furious, fiery farm lass who's sort of imperious, but then also smitten, by her love for this guy. I think the complicated unhappiness that was required of the Anthony character, I think it would have been hard for anyone who looked like Jamie Dornan to do that. I also just think it was not good.
Handsome
casting.
People can be sad too.
Of course they can. Of course they can. But he's not. He was best. The best thing I've seen him in was when he played the dead-eyed psychopathic, serial killer in The Fall, where he's just the sexy serial killer, and that felt like about the level of performance that made sense for him. But I don't. He's what he is, and that's great. I felt for him, and that's why I actually was impressed by he and Emily Blunt really got their chemistry going in that last scene, But before then, I felt like he was fumbling.
I do think that one of the reasons, I think there's actually a physicality to everything Emily Blunt does that helps in that scene. Emily Blunt's she's like an action star. Right. And she's a dance, she's in Sicario. She's in what's the movie where it's like the action Groundhog Day with Tom Cruise?
Edge of Tomorrow.
Edge of Tomorrow. She's
in the Quiet Place movies, which are sort of domestic and action movies. Yeah.
And then she also does Mary Poppins, where she's dancing.
Right. No, she's great. She's a true movie star. She's terrific. Yeah.
And I think her physicality,
absolutely,
she fills that dang kitchen up.
Yeah.
In a way that's really compelling. To me, she kind of helps make the movie. And I was going to ask you, who do you think is the main character in this movie? Ostensibly, it's Jamie Dornan's character,
right?
But I kind of wonder if it's not the movie's greatest sympathies are not with her. The last on the hillside, who is putting the time in her hair.
My sympathies were totally with her in the movie.
Yeah.
I think she's there's the problem that happens occasionally with movie. This was a little bit the case with The Master. I don't know if you ever saw this.
Yeah.
Which is a movie where the
probably my favorite director.
Oh yeah, he's wonderful, and I actually love that movie. I think that movie's really brilliant, and it's but I think one of the reasons it got a slightly colder reception than it might have is that I think that's a movie where the most obviously interesting character is not the protagonist. And I think she's really magnetic and really fascinating. And that's the old line a director told me a million years ago was the first act the actor's first job is to create interest. And she's really, really good at creating interest. She's the person you want to watch on the screen. And that's true. That can be true of beautiful actors. It can be true of character actors. It can be true of anybody.
For sure.
Jamie Dornan is really, really pretty. And he's working his ass off in this movie. And my heart went out to him. But he just doesn't draw attention the way she did. So no, I think the movie was sort of structured for him to be the protagonist, but she's the one who makes most of the interesting choices. She's the one you care about. She's the one who seems to go through the crisis where she goes to New York and back. So that just felt like a little bit of a formal problem with the movie. Which like,
but one thing that's interesting about
the world, but
yeah, one of the things interesting about that though is the way she is both like, okay, I'm going to use really broad sweeping terms here because I can't think of another way to put it, but she's like the agent of his sort of like salvation.
Yeah.
And I don't mean like in a, this is a Catholic movie salvation sense, but in the sense of like within the context of the story, she's like the agent that saves him.
Yeah.
Her affection for him, her commitment to him, her acceptance of him is what saves him. And yet she also is this deeply lonely, addicted person who's trying to figure out who she is, and her ability to be committed in her affection for him and also trying to figure out who she is one of the things that's really compelling about the story.
Oh, totally. I mean,
I'm sure that's in the play too.
No, yeah. I mean, certainly it is a little bit less pronounced in the play because they are a little bit better matched in the play. And they're also like, I'm seeing it on the page, but I'm imagining, Brian O'Byrne and Deborah Messing at her age. I think like that they're both in their 50s and these actors are both in their late 30s. So no, I mean, I think that's certainly true. It felt to me like, almost like behind every barely functional man is like a great woman is how it's like he definitely would be sort of lost if it were not for her. But that
so like, do you see that as too saccharine or do you see that as
no? Like I thought that was fine. Like it felt to me like there was a inside of this sort of weird, sometimes semi-magical, sometimes like corny, sometimes like slapstick movie. There was a pretty touching, fairly traditional love story that I totally like. I certainly don't think like, like the whole feminist, not feminist thing is just completely the wrong way to look at it. I just think like this is totally credible. There are people who fall in love this way. There are people who have relationships like this. This, I believe, this is specific and it's invested with, real care and it seems to matter to them. No, I have no objection at all to that. And again, like I sort of just wanted it to let itself be that weird, slightly old-fashioned movie,
Yeah, that's probably why I don't know, people respond to it so weirdly, because if it just had leaned into that more, they'd be like, no, this is just a weird movie, and right. That's what they would tell people.
I think people didn't like the goofiness of it, but they wouldn't have liked the heart of it if there'd been less goofiness.
It's almost like Princess Bride in the sense that it just leans all the way into Princess Bride does all the way into its sort of like just nonsenseness, him rolling down the hill and yelling as you wish, and the ridiculousness of the swamp, and the torture, like all of that is like we don't even pretend to like to have to try to like explain any of it. It just leans all the way into all those tropes and ideas in a way that it's just weird. But then now, and at the time, I think people were a little bit like, but then over time.
Oh, and Princess Bride's like a wonderful magical story, but you're actually, that's a really smart comparison, because I think you're right that there is something very campy and goofy about the Princess Bride and something really sincere and romantic about it.
Yeah. It's still like this, classic love story,
right? I mean, and very
in the midst
traditional,
of all this
old-fashioned
weirdness,
love story.
The silliness.
Totally. Yeah, and it just brings me back to like the difficulty of managing tone, which like even I feel like a terrible teacher sometimes. Like when I've taught a class in fiction recently, and I found myself again and again like pointing to these stories and saying like, wow, it would have been really easy for this story to be horrible and like unbearably annoying or like boring or sarcastic, and yet like the tone is just managed just right. And I think that's certainly the case with the Princess Bride. It does help to have you know what I think would have helped in this movie, because they sort of do it but they don't quite commit, is they have Christopher Walken do a voiceover, and he says, if an Irishman dies in the middle of a story, you bet that he'll be back.
Yeah. Yeah,
and
yeah.
and he does that kind of at the beginning and the end, and he says like, "Welcome to Ireland. Hey, I'm Tony Riley. I'm dead." And so it's a little bit outside the movie, but it doesn't feel like there's enough of a violation of the fourth wall. It feels a little bit like it's in the same soup of corny, goofy, magical Irishness that the whole movie's in. And I feel like there is a real benefit to, in The Princess Bride, the hard break between the world of the fairy tale and the world of the grandfather, the kind of the grouchy old,
I see what you're saying. Yeah,
what's his Columbo grandfather?
Yeah, Columbo guy.
Like that helps the tone a lot in the movie. And I think something like in a way, because you were talking
about framing device,
right? Yeah, and like the you're referring to the kind of phony Irishness as being a kind of like setting the stage for Americans to look at a story they might not be able to look at if it were set in America, by saying like, oh, let's imagine Ireland. But in a way, like I feel like you kind of want there to be, you want to see the edges a little more, to like it wouldn't take away from the magic. And like we will fall just as much in love with a story inside of a framing device as we will outside of one. But it will also, the framing device allows us to let go of any of that. What's the Keats line? Anxious,
negative,
anxious reaching after.
Yeah.
Whatever he says, the opposite of negative capability.
Yeah, and even if you had like that, that framing device at the end of it, you could have somebody being like, "What?"
Right.
Like you could have the little kid saying he, and then you say, "Did he actually think that?" But then the grandfather, like let's say we're borrowing the Princess Bride framing device, the grandfather could just not answer. So then it like brings the question to the fore, makes it part of the conversation, and highlights that.
Absolutely.
That's really interesting.
You can get away with so much by doing that, and you can really have your cake and eat it too with a device like that. So yeah, I mean,
I'm gonna have to think about this.
Yeah, that's the line that's like Nietzsche's account of the chorus in the Greek tragedy. Is it like that's sort of, they're like the grandfather and the kid that separate us from the world of the tragedy. So it's a little bit more than real, and that's okay. Like we don't have to believe that that Oedipus is like contiguous with our reality,
Yeah, who reads Henry V and doesn't like the chorus?
Yeah, I mean, and that's I don't know if you know the old Laurence Olivier Henry V.
Well, I mean, in the sense that I've watched it, but it's been
sure,
a decade probably.
But he does a really wonderful thing in that, where you see a really like richly realized vision of like effectively the Globe Theater, with people watching the play Henry V.
Okay, yeah.
And then you sort of zooms at some point, like you see a scene or two played out, or the prologue played out that way, and then you sort of zoom in on the backdrop, and you see even in the movie itself, when he sort of zooms into the backdrop, and suddenly you're in a more like a landscape with depth, and their castles and their knights and their horses, but you still have occasionally that backdrop that's like a fluttering scrim behind.
Yeah, so it's like what Branagh does, where at the beginning he has him backstage with all the props, but then later on he's walking out onto the cliffs by where they execute the traitors.
Yeah, no, exactly. So you do have that sense of being guided into a storytelling, not just into a story.
Yeah, and I can see that here, like even highlighting the sense of it being a folk tale or a fairy tale or something like that. Like you could have an Irish American grandfather telling like. Yeah. Maybe on the way, in a way, I could see the argument being, well, it kind of puts too fine of a point on it, and it maybe diminishes a little bit of the mystery of it. But
like if it's a story full of blarney, like that's great. Like that's what those stories are. Those stories are full of like things that don't make sense and things that are a little too real and a little too much.
Yeah, and yet they're also so real, right?
Yeah,
because who doesn't sometimes feel like they're something else? Although, have you read that Jamie Dornan in comments after it came out, people asked him, okay, explain the ending. And so he said, well, first of all, don't ever ask somebody to do that.
Don't have to asking actors like asking an athlete. Just let it
exactly.
go.
So then he says, well, I asked John Patrick Shanley what I'm supposed to, how he wants me to play this. Does he really think he is that? Or does he have some kind of mental health issue, or like, how do I supposed to feel this? And Shanley said, well, I think we all kind of feel like we're things that we're not sometimes. And Jamie Dornan said he kind of laughed about it, and he said, yeah, like we all feel like we're a bee. And Shanley's like very earnest, like, I think we really all do feel like we're things that we're not, but he wouldn't explain what he meant by that.
Right.
And
which
that's
is part of what's wonderful about Shanley's writing.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you see it in like I said, my friend Josh Gibbs, he's written about Joe versus the Volcano pretty extensively, and you get the same sort of questions and vibe even in Joe versus the Volcano and some of his other stuff. I mean, to a degree with Doubt as well, but that's a different tone.
That's quite a different tone. But no, I mean that's part of what is wonderful about his like the like deep sincerity of some of his choices is that you say like, oh, he doesn't think he's a bee, like she thinks she's a swan, as a kind of a self-conscious metaphor. He really thinks he's a bee. And she says, and apparently he said as well, we all think we're things we're not. There is some sense in which he is sort of putting his finger on the point that like, no, you believe you are something, you literally believe you are something you literally are not. Like we do carry around those actual delusions as well. They're just not as obvious to us as his is.
Right. And then you say on the one hand, you have the literalness, and then that bumps up against the metaphor of her with the swan. Yeah. And I like that the movie like kind of just leaves them both there, the literal and the metaphorical. Yeah. And then they have to she has to figure out how to navigate that. I think that's just a really fascinating way to just leave it. Right. To not answer that.
No, I mean, that's and she says in both of them, the play and the movie, she says, I'm mad as well. And he says, well, how are you mad? And she said, you won't find out until it's too late. It seems like, I mean, it felt like both a kind of an old fashioned and a relatively truthful depiction of falling in love and getting married. Like I believed it. And
are you familiar with Billy Wilder's movie, The Apartment?
No.
Okay, so it's one of my favorite movies.
Okay.
And in my view, it's like the greatest romantic comedy ever.
All right. It's about businessmen who buy an apartment to have affairs in.
There's a guy who works for an insurance company, and his bosses use his apartment.
I see.
They basically force him to let them use the apartment as their hideaway spot. But then he falls in love. This is 1959. He falls in love with the elevator operator, who basically he sort of also feels protective about because she's being treated poorly by their collective boss. And in a way, it's about these two people coming together and figuring out what that looks like, but also about what it means to be human, to be a jackass.
Right. Yeah.
And it's Jack Lemmon, Shirley MacLaine, Fred MacMurray. Like, it's an incredible cast. And I think about this movie in this, it doesn't have the magical realism, but I like them for some of the same reasons. And the endings both have that effect of what you're talking about, where she says, you'll find out when it's too late.
Yeah.
Because in The Apartment, at the end, they come together, having endured some sort of rough things together and looked out for each other. But there is also, it's not a pure resolution. There is also the sense of stasis, like that they're not all the way there as people or as their relationship. So there's hope, but you don't know what the future holds.
Right.
And so it's a romantic comedy that also holds that sort of tension that you never totally know a person. It's a romantic comedy that has like a really dark edge to it, like that has questions of suicide, that has questions of fate, that has questions of like, who are you? There's the scene where like the movie uses mirrors a lot, where people are like looking in mirrors either on purpose or on accident, and a lot of really interesting imagery. So to me, I watched they're very different movies, but I like them for some of the same reasons, because it holds both the romantic comedy elements and these sort of more complicated, occasionally dark questions and tension.
And that's actually it's a great context in which to have a not necessarily straightforward, but a sincere, touching love story, because it has all of the crassness and like harshness and sarcasm of these guys, this boss, using it's like in cruel behavior to his employee, presumably to some of these women. It's sort of, it's so ugly, and it's such a sort of a gross setting for a lovely story. I think that like the the darkness and ugliness and bleakness of the play makes for a. Do you know the Robert Van Warren essay "Pure and Impure Poetry"?
Not well.
He talks about how like part of what makes the balcony scene in Romeo and Juliet so credible is that it's preceded by this really profane rant by Mercutio about with all these puns on ladies' body parts. That it's like it's this point of like real crassness that then when it's only against that, it's against that black velvet that the diamonds of their sort of pure love scene sparkle. And I think there is something about this movie that it's beautiful and magical and sincere in its love story, but it doesn't have enough of there's not enough of a tonal
black
contrast
velvet?
A little like either darkness or like you need like a character. You have like the one character who's bad news Cleary who just tells people bad news, but like even like John Hamm is not, he's like he's sort of cartoonishly
like, what's going on around
right
here?
like he's like he rents a Rolls Royce, which is insane, and like can you even rent a Rolls Royce at a small town airport? But and then he says to her at one point, like, I'm of the school that says like you should let go of childish dreams because they're going to ruin your life, but otherwise like he's pretty understanding of everything. Like he's not like he like kisses her and he says, well, I'm a gentleman, so I'm going to walk you to your apartment. It's like, it's not like he's the Mercutio. He's just like a different guy who's like, is not the guy she falls in love with.
But in a way, he has to seem like a credible possibility.
Oh, totally. Right.
For her to actually have a choice.
No, I think, that's very true. And because she says, when he kisses her, she says, oh, what have you done? Do you know what you've done? Which is, of course, and presumably what he's done is he's made this a real possibility in her mind. So it is something to think. Yeah. So that's true, and that like he's probably not the right candidate for some contrasting backdrop. But I've read it like it was in some interview with Lars von Trier. I think it was when he was doing Melancholia, where he talked about
that's a movie,
right? Yeah, I love that. I love that movie. But he said like for him, he has such a bleak vision of the world that he always wants there to be hope in his movies, but he doesn't believe the hope unless it's set against the darkest possible background.
Yeah, I mean, it's Flannery O'Connor, right?
Right.
Like the redemption's meaningless unless there's a darkness that it is overcoming.
She would have been a good woman if it had been somebody that had hold a gun to her life every minute, or the underhead every minute of her life. Yeah.
No,
that's true.
No, I get that. I think probably like the tensions of like what you're going for in the marketplace.
Sure. Yeah.
Are so tricky for movies, and he probably should have just not worried about it.
You're saying this was never going to be a Lars von Trier movie?
Now Lars von Trier version of Wild Mountain Thyme, that would be quite a thing.
I would kind of be interested in seeing I guess his version of a romance was Breaking the Waves, which is just like
well, okay, so here's the thing. This would be a fast, like if you gave, let's give P.T. Anderson, we've got Shanley's version, Lars von Trier, Jane Campion,
right.
Who else? Like give like
Wes
5.
Anderson.
Wes Anderson. Oh well, that would be hilarious.
Yeah.
And then we need somebody else, and like you give them all this script and then see what happens. That would be fascinating because because of the concept and a lot of the way the script would read, the ways that you could interpret that are like numberless.
Steve McQueen, was that the name of the director who did Shame and 12 Years a Slave?
Yeah.
So I'd like to see his version too.
What about the guy who did If Beale Street Could Talk? And then he just did Underground Railroad.
Was the director of? No, I don't know who directed Underground Railroad.
Barry Jenkins.
Oh, okay, yeah.
There's. And then, of course, you could do like, who's the 1883 guy? Taylor Sheridan.
Oh God, yeah, the Yellowstone. Yeah,
Yellowstone. Yeah, then do the Taylor Sheridan. I mean, there's just like all of these guys could bring their own view.
That's great. So
way of doing it.
When we need Goldberry Studios to fund this multi-billion-dollar project.
Let's start P.T. Anderson because I'd love to know what he would do with this.
Yeah, no, that's
because like you look at Punch Drunk Love, and there's some similar elements in that story to this one.
Yeah, that's a I rewatched that recently, and it's captivating and beautiful, and the actors are so good in it. Another great brief Philip Seymour Hoffman performance.
True.
But I couldn't help but watching it this time think like, oh, this is a movie about people with borderline personality disorder. Like it's which I guess is part like it's so intense and extreme and insane that it needs to be a really short movie and then just end there. And
you seen Phantom Thread?
Yeah, which is I actually was thinking of like that's a kind of an interesting companion romance to Punch Drunk Love, because it's another like sort of toxic romance that has, but it's also not like you can't dismiss it, you can't write it off.
Right. Well, but then in that movie, while he is kind of like a narcissist, you don't watch that movie and go, "Oh yeah, this is the movie about the narcissist."
No. Yeah, exactly. Like that's true.
I think I go back and forth on this. I think that might be his best movie. And I mean, I love, There Will Be Blood and The Master. And The Master I find a little less rewatchable.
Right. Yeah. I saw Hard Eight recently for the first time, which is tough to watch, but very good. I mean, The Phantom Thread is so exquisitely made.
It's just so precise.
Yeah.
Like when he gets all wandery, like, that's great, but it's a different thing. And when he does this, when he gets that like so precise the way he does in Phantom Thread, where like no shot, no moment is out of place. I mean, that's not what we're here to talk about, but and my computer's probably going to die before we get through that one. But
yeah. I want to ask you, this is sort of a non sequitur, but you host the Daily Poem along with Close Reads, and I'm curious because you are. This will reveal my prejudice. I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, which is Baptist country. I was raised Catholic there, and my impression as a kid, I went to Catholic school. Most of the people I knew were Catholic, and there's some Jewish family that married into our family, so we had some of those friends. But my impression was that Catholics and Jews were intellectuals, and Protestants were not. And then I moved to Maryland, and we're like, there are lots of Catholics, and I was like, oh, there are like dumb, ignorant Catholics too. But I also then like part of what I find fascinating about like you run this bookshop and these podcasts, and you've even said on Twitter like you explicitly like are not interested in like books or stories that are movies that are trying to teach a lesson. Maybe I read that wrong, but I think that was what you said.
Yeah, I would say that. While I would say that there's more to that than
how of course, put it in it's not simplistic.
240 characters or whatever, but I would say that.
Yeah, but you and your affiliations are with like honest to God, classically grounded intellectual Protestants, which I'm just sort of fascinated by because I didn't encounter that growing up. But
although ironically, my family and I are Greek Orthodox or Eastern.
Oh, you're Greek Orthodox. Oh, maybe
Antiochian Orthodox, but that's not that's not where I came from.
Oh, okay. Oh, so you converted?
Yes.
Oh, interesting. Okay, yeah. That is a conversation for another night. That's fascinating.
But, I mean, I think that a lot of the Protestant intellectual tradition in America is complex.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. There certainly is a tradition. I encounter it less in contemporary culture, contemporary conversation. I guess I'm used to hearing brainy, bossy Catholics declaim about brainy, bossy Catholicism. But no, the question I have specifically is this. It's a problem I've run into recently in thinking specifically about lyric poems and lyric poems of a particular kind, which is poems in which the consolation or the volta or the final turn is grounded in the not necessarily something as simple or something not simple, but something as discrete as the existence or non-existence of God, but basically like the hopefulness or bleakness of the universe. And I think it's different with epic poetry. It's different with dramatic poetry. It's different when you have a lot more architecture, but specifically with the lyric, where the goal is to stir an emotion in the reader. I find that while I have great admiration for the structure and the the deftness and the subtlety of some of Herbert's poems, and some like Donne has a range, but like some of his holy sonnets, and like Gerard Manley Hopkins, I find that the constellation or the turn or the but this of those poems leaves me cold, because it often relies on, but don't worry, things will be okay. Like there's this other source of hope. And because I don't believe in God, I think, well, shit, that seems sort of disappointing that be like, I want to believe that art is richer than just what, than needing to answer strictly to what you believe. And conversely, I know a lot of religious people who find some of the poems of like Larkin or Hardy or Stevens to be sentimental in their bleakness, to be sort of like excessive, or like they kind of roll their eyes at the what's the postman, like doctors go from house to house, or whatever the ending of Albad is. Like they roll their eyes a little bit in a way that feels parallel at the kind of the nothingness at the heart of some of those poems. Whereas I find that in a way not consoling, but I hear an echo in those poems that makes me feel less alone. So I'm curious, because you're somebody who reads very Catholically, small c, and I know you have an admiration for Larkin and Hardy and others. Is that a problem that even comes up for you at all, or is that something that what do you make of that? Is that just my own neuroses?
I would imagine that even if it's not a problem that I have, it's probably not just your own neuroses. Well, okay. Yeah, that's a big question. Or at least one that I need to think about.
It's a weird question.
I think I am always more interested personally in poetry that ends with more questions than answers.
Sure. Yeah.
The poems that end with a surprise, where that turn is, it's saying, okay, this is, you thought the poem was about this, but then now we've got this question here, and that's going to reshape the way you think about the 8 or 12 lines that came before, or whatever it is. I mean, even in like sometimes in contemporary sonnets, especially, you'll even get that, like they'll use the architecture of the form to reshape what the poem is about. So I think there is a sense in which I do understand. I don't always find the sort of hopefulness of those sort of religious lyric poems to be particularly as meaningful as I think they are for some people, or as they intend to be.
Okay.
So although we maybe have different theological perspectives or beliefs or whatever, I understand where you're coming from on that, and I find that poems that leave me contemplating the questions or even doubts are more theologically and spiritually consoling than the ones that provide all the answers. I think that, but I want to add this. I think that the best of those kind of poems, like especially like Donne's poems, which you mentioned is a little different, are embedded with a great deal of doubt as well. And like even the metaphors of faith and like relationship with God and things like that are so complex and varied and strange that they kind of like raise the question of what it, like they raise doubts about the question of what, I don't know if it's doubts, they raise questions about the nature of relationship with God that are very complex,
right?
So that you don't, even if at the end he seems to put a fine point on it, everything that came before it is more complex. I think the greatest poems, even the greatest religious poems and stories, manage to do that.
Yeah.
I think that takes us back to O'Connor again too, but I don't know if that answers your question.
No, I think that actually does help, because I mean, that's like, there's all the difference in the world to me between Batter My Heart and Death Be Not Proud. Like I think of like, dearly I love thee and would be loved fain, but am betrothed unto thine enemy. Like the tension in Batter My Heart between what he wants to do and feel, and the way he wants to live, and the way he finds himself living, and he says, I'll never be chaste unless you ravish me. Like literally, I won't live right unless you rape me, unless you force yourself on me. That is a feeling, a lyric feeling I can understand, regardless of what I believe in. I think Death You're Not Proud and some other
poems,
a
desperation.
Yeah, right.
In the imagery.
I think there's some poems where, and Herbert does this sometimes, where like the ending feels a little bit like, ta-da, God. And that I just find like, and you know what, I thought of another example is, which is not a religious poem at all, but Shakespeare's Sonnet 30, which is beautiful and rightly, celebrated, When to the Sessions of Sweet Silent Thought. But it is like 29, but it goes, the Volta comes a little later in 30, and the Volta, after all of this bad shit he's moaning about, the sad account of four bemoaned moan, which I knew pay as if not paid before, and everything's awful, and there's no hope. And then he ends, but if the while I think on thee, dear friend, all losses are restored and sorrows end. And I always think like, bullshit. Like, what? Like, if the while I think on thee, dear friend, all losses are restored and sorrows end. Why? What? How? What?
Why are we here?
Right. Like, so to me, that's like ta-da, the beloved, but it feels to me very much like ta-da, God. Like, yeah. It's an answer that's provided, that's meant to that offer consolation, but it doesn't move.
But it doesn't. So it doesn't move me, I don't think either, but it does, in a sense, suggest the degree of the love that the poet has for the person who he is writing to, and is Shakespeare in that case.
It's almost like an epic simile or a Yo Mama joke, which similar, like they have like the similar structure where they build up with this big, like a big image or a big a scene, and then the end of that is the whole point of it is because Yo Mama so fat, or like, and in that way did he cut through the throngs, or like, and that's how much I love you. They have that kind of front loaded structure.
I would not have thought to put it that way, but I think that about sums it up.
Yeah, excellent. Well, thank you so much for doing this. I know I've kept you for a while, but I'm really grateful, and I had a lot of fun talking with you about this weird fucking movie, which I'm glad I saw. I would not have read the play or seen the movie if not for you. So.
It's interesting. It's one of those movies that I don't think is perfect, and I've watched it a bunch, as you said. I agree with a lot of your assessments. I think it has its flaws, but it's also one of those movies that the things that I really like, and so I like to rewatch it, and I think that it has a lot to offer in that. And I think that people don't know how to watch it, and I don't think people take it on its own terms, and I think that's why it has got some bad press. But I don't think people were ready to,
No, they were not going to. People came in expecting any number of things, and
I would love to talk to Shanley and find out what he was anticipating his Rotten Tomatoes score would be.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, if you're making art because you're trying to like get a certain Rotten Tomato score, then get out of the game. But you know what I mean?
No, certain. I mean, and there are movies I love that were not that flopped. Yeah, like that. And Rotten Tomatoes today even feels like less and less reliable when you see the big disparities between their scores and the public response.
Even this movie was a 50% audience, which is higher than I thought, and then 26% or whatever. So
which probably sounds about right. Yeah. No, and I think I'm with you. And like the thing about this movie that is good is a thing that is hard to find in other places. Like whether this is the right vessel for it or not, it's a thing that it's worth digging out of this weird little composition.
And I want more movies to be made where people are going for it. Like they're going for a particular vision. They're going for something that you're not going to find everywhere else, because every movie now is so the same.
Yeah.
There's just so many movies that are the same. That's why you like see this year Coda, which is I would argue like
what's Coda?
It's a movie that nominated for Best Picture, and it's an Apple TV movie, and it's about a girl who is the child of deaf people, and she wants to be a singer. She has this great skill, and so it's about her carving out a way to be this singer, despite the fact that they're fishermen in Massachusetts off the coast, and they need her help, and it's about their family, and it's very pleasant.
What was that ballet movie Billy something a while ago about the Northern English kid.
Oh shoot.
Billy something.
Billy Madison.
Billy.
I can't remember what it's called.
Yeah. But something. Yeah. Okay.
But
she
it's
comes from working class context and deaf parents
and they're deaf and she's this amazing talent and it's got nominated for Best Picture and it's a pretty good movie. I don't know that it's the best movie.
Sure. Yeah.
It's got some great performances, but it's also a movie with a particular vision that's not a superhero movie. And I think that people are like, they still make movies like this in America. Like we don't have to watch a Danish director.
Right. Yeah.
And it's not P.T. Anderson.
Right. Yeah. No,
and so I think that I appreciate it when we're able to get a movie like Wild Mountain Thyme that's although it has some of the trappings of traditional romantic comedy, it's also going for things that most people can't get away with.
Right. Yeah. So. I know. I'm with you there. Like I would rather see you do your weird thing and then let's see what the result. Maybe who knows?
Go weirder.
That was my conversation with David Kern. You can find him on Twitter at @DAKern. You can also find him at Goldberry Books in Concord, North Carolina, and on the podcasts Close Reads, The Daily Poem, Bibliography now I think is already doing quite well, and another kids podcast that does not exist yet, but I'm sure will come into existence dazzlingly soon enough. Thanks so much to David for speaking with me this week, and thank you to all of you for listening. You can reach me, as always, at sleerickets@gmail.com or on Twitter at sleerickets. Thank you so much. With any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.